I've been riding for 53 years, and in 53 years I've heard a lot of stories. Most of them I've forgotten. This one I haven't. A man named Travis Boone sat at his kitchen table and watched his coffee tremble, not from sound, but from pressure. The kind that doesn't negotiate, the kind that takes a roof, 2 walls, and 11 years of a life and puts them somewhere in the Oklahoma sky. He called the VA, 47 minutes on hold. He called the city, they said they'd call back, they didn't. And then 7 motorcycles turned onto Archer Street. The men the neighborhood didn't want near their children were the only ones who came with their hands. I need you to understand what was owed before I tell you what was given. I've been riding for 51 years. I buried brothers I loved like blood. I've sat in clubhouses from California to Tennessee, shared bottles with men the world had already written off, and I've heard stories that would make a preacher weep and a judge lose sleep. But the one that stays with me, the one that still comes back on nights when the wind picks up and the fire burns low, is the story Bull Cooper told me in the Lawton chapter's back room on a Tuesday in late April, 3 years after it happened. Bull doesn't talk much. That's the first thing you need to understand about Randall Cooper. He's the kind of man who fills a room just by standing still. 6'2", shoulders like a barn door, a gray beard that touches his collarbone. He's been patched in longer than some of our guys have been alive. When Bull speaks, men lean in, not because he demands it, because whatever comes out of his mouth earned its way there. That night he was sitting at the far end of the table, one boot propped on a chair, a glass of whiskey untouched in front of him. Most of the chapter had cleared out by 10. It was just me, Bull, and a younger member named Travis, who'd fallen asleep against the wall with his cut still on. The jukebox in the front room was playing something slow and tinny through the half-open door. Bull said, "You ever hear about the guy in Comanche County, the one from the tornado?" I said I hadn't. He said, "Pour yourself a drink. It's a long one." So I did, and he started talking. His name was William Henry Kowalski, 58 years old when it happened. Everybody in the township of Fletcher, about 40 miles south of Lawton, out where the land goes flat and the sky gets enormous. Everybody knew him as just Hank. He'd been Hank since the 3rd grade, when his teacher had decided William Henry was too much name for a boy his size. Hank had done 2 tours in Iraq. First Gulf War, early 90s. He'd gone in as infantry and come back in a different kind of body, one that needed a wheelchair to move through the world. An IED on a road outside Basra had taken most of the function from his legs and left him with nerve damage down his left side that made the cold feel like being stabbed with a hot poker. He was 26 years old when it happened. The VA had helped the way the VA helps, which is to say, eventually, imperfectly, and with the kind of paperwork that makes a man feel like a burden before he's received a single thing. He'd gone through the grief and the rage and the dark years that most combat veterans who come home broken have to go through, whether anyone talks about it or not. He'd had a wife for a while. They'd lasted 7 years, which is longer than most people expected, and shorter than Hank had hoped. No kids. Just a modest house on 2 acres outside Fletcher. A beat-up, accessible van with a lift that worked most of the time. A golden retriever named Sergeant, and a pension that covered the basics if he was careful. He was careful. He'd always been careful. By the time he was 58, Hank had built something small but real out of what remained. He tended a vegetable garden along the south side of the house, raised beds built low enough for a man in a chair to reach into. He'd learned to cook well, the way people learn things when they have a lot of time alone. He had a workshop in the garage where he fixed small engines, lawnmowers, generators, the occasional go-kart for a neighbor's kid. He was good with his hands, always had been, and the work kept him from thinking too hard about the things he couldn't change. His neighbor, Dale Hutchins, lived about a quarter-mile east. They had the kind of relationship that rural Oklahoma tends to produce, between two stubborn men who respect each other but would never admit it directly. They traded produce, lent tools, and complained about the county road commission together. Dale was 62 and hadn't quite figured out how to be easy around Hank's chair, but he'd stopped flinching when he saw it years ago, and that was something. Fletcher was a quiet place, the kind of town that shows up as a dot on a state map. There was a Dollar General, a post office, a Baptist church that also served as the community center, and a feed store that had been in the same family since 1947. People knew each other. That could be good. It could also be suffocating, in the way that small places sometimes are, where everybody's business is everybody's business, and a man who's different tends to attract a particular kind of attention that has nothing to do with kindness. Hank didn't complain about it. He'd stopped complaining about most things after Basra. What was the point? But on the afternoon of May 7, 2021, a Thursday, late spring, the sky going that particular shade of green that anyone who grew up in Oklahoma knows means trouble. Everything Hank had built in 30 years of quiet determination was taken from him in less than 4 minutes. The tornado that hit Fletcher was an EF3, winds up to 165 miles per hour. It carved a path through the southern edge of the township that was a quarter-mile wide and nearly 6 miles long. It took 2 houses completely. It damaged 11 more. It knocked out power to the whole area for 9 days. Hank's house was one of the 2 it took completely. He survived because his accessible van was parked in the driveway, and because Sergeant, who had heard something in the air that Hank's human ears had missed, had started barking 20 minutes before the sirens went off. Hank had wheeled himself out to the van, managed to get the lift working on the second try, and driven north as fast as the van would go. He'd pulled into the parking lot of a Quick Trip on the highway and watched in his rearview mirror as the sky turned black and the earth stopped making sense. When he drove back to Fletcher 2 hours later, there was nothing left of his house. The foundation was bare concrete with debris scattered across it. Insulation, glass, pieces of furniture he couldn't identify anymore, a single shoe. The garden was gone, the workshop was gone, the raised beds he'd spent 3 weekends building were gone. Sergeant was in the back of the van, pressed against the rear door, shaking. Hank sat in the parking lot of where his house had been for a long time without moving. His neighbors came by. Dale Hutchins stood at the edge of the property line for a while, then walked back to his own house without saying anything. The Baptist church organized a collection drive within 48 hours. The county emergency management office sent a woman named Sandra Briggs, who arrived with a clipboard and asked Hank if he had renter's insurance, which he did not, and then explained the FEMA application process in a voice that was not unkind, but was very, very tired. The local news sent a crew. Hank declined to speak on camera. After that, things got quiet. That's the part that nobody talks about. The immediate response, the casseroles and the donation bins and the news vans, that lasts about 2 weeks. And then the community moves on, because communities have to move on, because life continues and other things need attention. And Hank Kowalski, quiet, private, in his wheelchair out on the edge of town, Hank was easy to forget. He spent the first month in a FEMA-designated temporary housing unit. It was an RV parked in the lot behind the Baptist church. Technically accessible, practically miserable. The ramp was steep and the doorways were tight, and the shower required contortions that left his shoulders aching. Sergeant slept on the floor next to his bunk. Hank lay awake most nights listening to the sound of the Oklahoma wind through the aluminum walls and thought about Iraq, which he hadn't thought about that specifically in years. He thought about what it felt like to be inside a body that didn't work the way you needed it to, in a world that had been built for a different kind of body, waiting for systems that move slowly to decide what your life was worth. He'd felt this before. He knew what it was. It was the particular loneliness of being a problem that nobody wanted to look at directly. The FEMA process, as Sandra Briggs had explained it, was a process. That was perhaps the most honest thing anyone said to Hank in those first weeks. It was a process, meaning it existed, meaning it moved, meaning it would eventually produce an outcome. When that outcome would arrive and what it would look like were variables that the process itself could not reliably predict. Hank filed the application on a Tuesday. He did it at the Fletcher Public Library, which had generator power and had opened its doors as a community resource point in the aftermath of the storm. A volunteer named Peggy helped him navigate the website, which crashed twice and required him to re-enter information he had already entered. By the end of the afternoon, the application was submitted. Peggy gave him a printed confirmation number and told him he'd hear back within 30 days. He heard back in 46. The initial award was $3,800 for housing assistance. The letter explained, in the kind of language that is designed to be technically correct and functionally incomprehensible, that the amount reflected the assessed value of his temporary housing needs and that additional aid could be applied for through a supplemental review process. Hank read the letter 3 times in the RV behind the Baptist church. His house, the one he'd owned outright, the one he'd paid off a decade ago, the one he'd spent years modifying for accessibility with his own hands, had been appraised at $87,000 before the tornado. There was nothing left of it but a concrete slab. He called the number at the bottom of the letter. He was on hold for 42 minutes. When he reached a human being, she was polite and careful and told him that $3,800 was the standard initial disbursement and that to receive additional funds, he would need to complete the supplemental review form, which he could find on the website or request by mail. She could not tell him how long the supplemental review would take. She wished him well. Grace Ann Mercer was the social worker assigned to Hank through the VA. She'd been working with him for 3 years at that point, since he'd transferred into the Lawton VA's care management program following a hospitalization for a cardiac episode that had turned out to be less serious than feared, but had frightened them both. She was 45, with green eyes and the particular kind of calm that people develop when they've spent years watching bureaucracies fail the people they're supposed to help. She was good at her job in the way that good social workers are good at their job, which means she knew exactly what the system could and couldn't do, and she fought for every inch of what it could. When she heard about the tornado, she drove down to Fletcher the next morning. She found Hank in the RV, sitting at the small table with Sergeant's head in his lap, looking at the confirmation number printout. He hadn't eaten that morning. She knew this because there was no evidence of food preparation, and because she had learned to read his silences after 3 years. She sat down across from him and said, "Tell me where you are." He said, "The FEMA gave me 3,800. She didn't react visibly, which was itself a reaction. She pulled out her notebook. "Okay," she said, "we're going to work through every option there is. VA Emergency Housing Assistance, HUD, the Oklahoma Department of Emergency Management, State Disability Housing Grants, nonprofits." She looked up. "We're going to find a way through this." Hank nodded. He believed her, because Grace Ann was not in the business of saying things she didn't mean. But he had also lived 58 years in a country that was very good at providing documents explaining what might theoretically be possible for men in his situation, and less good at actually producing those possibilities in any time frame that corresponded to a human life. He said, "How long do you think it'll take?" She was quiet for a moment. That meant she was being honest rather than reassuring. "Realistically," she said, "the way things are moving, 6 months for emergency grants, 12 to 18 for anything involving new construction. There's a wait list for accessible housing in Comanche County that's 3 years long." 3 years. Hank looked out the small window of the RV at the flat Oklahoma sky. "I can't live in this thing for 3 years, he said. "No," she said, "you can't." She began making calls that same afternoon. She was methodical and relentless, which were perhaps the 2 most important qualities a person could bring to the project of navigating American social services. She called the VA Housing Authority. She called 2 nonprofit organizations that specialized in veteran housing. She called the Oklahoma Housing Finance Agency. She called a disability advocacy organization in Oklahoma City. Everyone was sympathetic. Everyone had a process. Meanwhile, Hank existed in the RV. The thing about the RV, the thing that doesn't come through in any paperwork or assessments, was what it did to a man's sense of himself. Hank had spent 30 years building a life around the idea that he could manage. That was the core of it, not independence in some abstract, inspirational sense, but the practical daily fact of being a man who managed his own affairs. He cooked his own food. He maintained his own property. He fixed things when they broke. He had a chair that moved him through a world that wasn't built for him. And he had learned every workaround and adaptation that made that world navigable. The RV erased most of that. The kitchen counter was at the wrong height. The shower was too narrow for his chair, so he had to transfer to a plastic stool that slid on the wet floor and required a sequence of movements that exhausted him. The ramp to get in and out was positioned such that he needed a running start to get up it safely, and on rainy days the surface got slick. The whole thing was 12 feet long and smelled like other people's vacations. He didn't complain. He wasn't going to complain. But Dale Hutchins came by one afternoon, walking the quarter-mile from his own house, which had lost its east-facing windows and gained a significant dent in the roof, but was otherwise standing, and found Hank sitting outside the RV in his chair, just sitting in the afternoon sun, with Sergeant beside him, and no particular expression on his face. Dale stood there for a minute. Then he said, "You eating?" Hank said, "Yeah." Dale said, "You need anything?" Hank said, "No." Dale nodded. He stood there another minute. Then he said, "Town council had a meeting. They're looking at options for temporary shelter." Hank waited. Dale said, "They're talking about whether the church can expand the RV section, put in 2 more units." "For who?" Hank asked. Dale looked at the ground. "Miller's and the Wests." He paused. Both of them had full house losses too. Both of those families had also lost their homes in the tornado. Both of them had young children. Both of them were, as the town council would not have said directly, but would have understood implicitly, more visible problems than a 58-year-old wheelchair-using bachelor with a dog. Hank understood this. He didn't resent it exactly. Resources were finite. Children were children. He understood the math. He said, "Makes sense." Dale stood there a while longer, looking uncomfortable in the way that men look when they want to say something they don't quite know how to say. Finally he said, "It's not right, Hank. What happened to you?" Hank looked at him. It was probably the most direct thing Dale Hutchins had ever said to him in 12 years of neighborly acquaintance. "No," Hank said, "it's not." Dale went home. The afternoon went quiet. Sargent put his head on Hank's knee and looked up at him with the patient, attentive eyes that dogs use when they understand that something is wrong and have decided that the most useful thing they can offer is their presence. Hank stayed outside until the sun went down. In the second week of June, 5 weeks after the tornado, Grace Ann called him with a preliminary offer from a veteran housing nonprofit, a studio apartment in Lawton, accessible, more or less, available in 90 days. Studio apartment, 40 miles from Fletcher, no yard, no workshop, no garden. Hank thanked her. He asked her to keep the option open. He did not say yes. He started, quietly and without mentioning it to anyone, going through the numbers, the FEMA money, the small amount of savings he had, what he could potentially borrow against his pension, what reconstruction of even a basic minimal house on his slab would actually cost, accounting for the accessibility modifications he needed. The number he arrived at was far larger than anything he had access to. He was looking at that number on a notepad one evening when the phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize, a 580 area code, which was Lawton, but not a number in his contacts. He almost didn't answer. He answered. The voice on the other end was deep and unhurried. It said, "Is this William Henry Kowalski, the veteran who lost his house in Fletcher?" Hank said yes. The voice said, "My name is Randall Cooper. I ride with the Hells Angels out of Lawton. We heard about your situation. We'd like to come talk to you if that's all right." Hank told me, through Bull, that his first response to that phone call was something close to confusion. He knew who the Hells Angels were, in the way that everyone in Oklahoma knew who the Hells Angels were. The leather cuts, the patches, the reputation that came before them like weather. He'd seen them on the highway sometimes, a pack of bikes moving in formation, loud and deliberate in the way of things that are comfortable, taking up space. He'd never had any contact with them. He'd never had occasion to. His second response, once the confusion cleared, was a kind of wariness that he would have been embarrassed to name directly, but that Bull told it plainly. Hank thought it might be some kind of scam. A man in a bad situation, a sympathetic story in the local paper. It wasn't out of the realm of possibility that someone had read that story looking for an angle. He said he'd think about it. He called Grace Ann. He described the call. He asked what she thought. Grace Ann was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've heard of them doing this. The Angels. Some chapters do veteran outreach, rebuilds, fundraisers. It's real. A pause. I'd say talk to them. You don't have to agree to anything. Hank called the number back. Randall Cooper, Bull, said he could come by the next afternoon. Hank said that was fine. He didn't ask how many people Bull was bringing. He didn't think to ask. The next afternoon, 7 motorcycles pulled into the lot behind the Baptist church. Bull was in front. The other 6 spread out behind him as they parked. Big bikes, the sound of them settling into silence after so much noise, all of it somehow more deliberate than it had any right to be. 7 men climbed off. All of them wore the cut. All of them were looking at the RV. Hank was sitting outside in his chair. Sergeant was beside him, ears up but not alarmed. Hank watched them come across the lot. Bull walked ahead of the others. He was as advertised. Large, gray-bearded, taking his time. He extended a hand. "Hank," he said. "Yeah," Hank said. They shook. Bull had a handshake like closing a door. Firm but not aggressive, just unambiguous. Bull gestured at the chair. Not at it exactly, more around it, acknowledging it without making it a thing. "Iraq?" he asked. "Yeah, 91. Bull nodded. 2 of the men behind him had the same stillness, Hank noticed. The way combat veterans hold themselves, like they're always occupying slightly less space than their bodies actually take up. A habit learned in places where taking up space was dangerous. "We lost 2 brothers over there," Bull said. "Different chapters. Good men." "I'm sorry," Hank said. Bull looked at the spot where Hank's house had been. From the church lot, you could see the edge of Hank's property, the bare slab visible above the low rise of the road. "We want to rebuild it," Bull said. Hank looked at him. "Not the government, not a non-profit, us." Bull's voice was even. "We've done it before. We raised money for a brother in Tulsa 2 years ago after a fire. We've got connections, building supply places that'll give us materials at cost or below. Our guys can do framing, roofing, electrical, plumbing. We find subcontractors when we need them." He paused. "We want to do this for you." Hank was quiet for a long time. One of the things Bull had described to me, and this is the part that I think about, was what Hank's face looked like during that silence. Bull said it wasn't skepticism, exactly, and it wasn't gratitude either. It was something more complicated. It was the face of a man who had spent months dealing with systems that processed him, assessed him, filed paperwork about him, and put him on wait lists, and who was now being looked at directly as a person by someone offering something concrete. That is a different kind of experience than most people understand, unless they've been through something that puts them at the mercy of systems for a while. Finally, Hank said, "Why?" Bull looked at him steadily. "Because you served. Because you lost everything. Because nobody else is moving fast enough." He let that sit for a moment. "And because it's the right thing to do." Hank said, "You don't know me." "No," Bull said, "but I know what you are. You're a man who went when they called and got left behind when you came back broken. That's a story I've seen before." He paused. "We don't leave men behind. That's our version of it." Hank asked about cost. Bull said they weren't asking for anything. Hank asked how long it would take. Bull said 4 to 6 weeks for a basic structure, livable and accessible. Hank asked why they were doing this instead of helping some of their own. Bull said, "We take care of our own. That doesn't mean we only take care of our own." The other 6 men had said nothing during this entire conversation. They stood slightly back, patient, not imposing. One of them was stroking Sergeant's ears. The dog had gone to him immediately and was now leaning against his leg. Hank watched this for a moment. Then he said, "All right." News in Fletcher traveled fast, as news in small towns does. By the following morning, the word was out. The Hells Angels were going to rebuild Hank Kowalski's house. The response was not uniformly warm. Dale Hutchins showed up at Hank's RV before 8 o'clock. He stood at the bottom of the ramp and said, "Hank, you know who those men are?" Hank said he did. Dale said, "They're not, you've heard the things people say about them." Hank said, "I've also heard that they're going to come build me a house." Dale opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I'm just saying you might want to think about the impression it makes in the community." Hank looked at him for a long time. He said, "Dale, the community put me in an aluminum box for 6 weeks. I think I'm past worrying about impressions." Dale left. The reactions at the Baptist church, which had by this point become something of a coordination center for the township's recovery, was similarly mixed. The pastor, a careful and decent man named Robert Featherstone, came to speak with Hank. He was diplomatic about it. He expressed no direct objection, but he mentioned twice that there were other avenues still being explored, that the nonprofit housing situation in Lawton was still a possibility, that the church had a relationship with a veteran-focused charity out of Oklahoma City that might be able to assist. All of this was true. None of it was happening fast enough to matter. Hank thanked him. He did not change his answer. Sandra Briggs from FEMA came by to check on the status of his supplemental application, which was still pending, which it would continue to be for another 11 weeks, and asked in the careful tone of a person choosing her words deliberately whether Hank had considered all the implications of accepting assistance from a motorcycle club with a complicated legal history. Hank said, "With respect, Sandra, my house is gone and the money isn't here. They're offering to build me something I can live in. That's the implication I'm focused on." Sandra nodded slowly. She wrote something in her folder. She left. The only person who came without reservations was Grace Ann, who showed up 2 days after Bull's visit with coffee and a notepad and said, "Tell me what they said they'd do. I want to make sure the build covers your accessibility needs." That was Grace Ann, straight to the practical thing. They spent 2 hours going through it. Wider doorways, at least 36 inches, a zero threshold shower, counter heights in the kitchen, a ramp rather than steps at the entrance, reinforced bathroom walls for grab bars, adequate turning radius in the main living areas. Hank had carried this list in his head for 30 years. The modifications that made a house livable versus merely habitable for a man in his situation. Some of them had been in the house the tornado took. Some had been on the list of things he hadn't gotten to yet. Now he was being asked to speak them aloud to someone who was writing them down with the apparent intention of making them real. He found this harder than he expected. Grace Ann noticed. She put down the pen. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "It's just..." He stopped. "A lot of people have asked me about this situation. What I lost, what I need. Nobody asked me what I actually needed in a house. You know, they talked about the house. They didn't ask what would make it work for me." Grace Ann nodded. "I should have asked sooner. You had a system to navigate." "I did. That's not an excuse." She picked up the pen again. "Keep going." The crew arrived on the first Monday of July. 23 men. Bull had called in help from 3 chapters, Lawton, Oklahoma City, and Tulsa. They came in on a Sunday evening. Enough bikes to make the Baptist church lot sound like an air show. They set up a camp in the field adjacent to Hank's slab, tents, a folding table, a propane grill. They were organized and quiet about it, with the efficiency of men who had done this before or something like it. The following morning at 7, they began. Hank sat in the chair at the edge of his slab and watched the first lumber arrive. I'm going to tell this the way Bull told it to me, without trying to make it more than it was, and without making it less. These were not gentlemen in any conventional sense. Several of them had records. Several of them had histories that most people in Fletcher would have found alarming if they'd known the specifics. They were loud at the end of each workday. They drank beer in the evening, and the poker games got competitive. One of them had a dog with a spiked collar that frightened a woman walking past on the road. They were also, in every interaction with Hank and with his property and with the project they had taken on, absolutely professional. The framing crew, 4 men who turned out to have significant construction experience between them, worked from plans that accounted for every accessibility specification on Grace Ann's list. When they had questions, they asked Hank. When Hank made suggestions based on what he'd known of his previous house, they listened and usually incorporated them. By Wednesday of the first week, the framing was up. Hank watched it rise from the slab where his old house had stood and felt something he couldn't quite name for a long time. He sat out there in the morning heat, Sergeant beside him, and watched these strangers. Men the world had decided to fear, men whose patch carried a reputation that preceded them into every room they entered. Build walls on the ground where a tornado had taken everything. On the 4th day, something happened that Bull described as the moment the whole thing shifted. One of the younger riders, a kid named Jesse, 24, from the Oklahoma City chapter, on the crew because he was a licensed electrician, had been running wire in the new wall framing when he came out to ask Hank a question about outlet placement. They got to talking. Jesse had grown up in Lawton. His grandfather had been Army. He asked Hank about Iraq the way young men sometimes ask veterans about wars, with genuine curiosity and a kind of careful respect, not morbid fascination. Hank answered. He told Jesse a little about what it had been like before Basra, the landscape, the heat that was different from Oklahoma heat, the particular quality of fear that becomes routine, which is one of the strangest things the human body can do. Jesse listened. Then Jesse said, "My grandpa didn't talk about his war much. I always wondered what it was like for him." Hank said, "Most of us don't talk about it much." Jesse said, "Why not?" Hank was quiet for a moment. He said, "Because when you come home, you're supposed to be glad. And you are glad. But glad doesn't mean okay." And explaining that to people who weren't there, he shrugged. "It gets tiring." Jesse nodded slowly. He looked at the walls going up around them. He said, "Well, for what it's worth, I think what happened to you, losing this after everything, I think it's wrong. I'm glad we're here." It was not a complicated thing to say. It was, in fact, a very simple thing. But Hank Kowalski, who had been doing his best not to feel anything in particular about what had happened to him since May 7th, felt it. He said, "Yeah, me too." 3 weeks into the build, the news van came back. This time it wasn't a local station. It was a crew from the NBC affiliate out of Oklahoma City, chasing a story that had made its way up through the regional news cycle. Hell's Angels rebuilding disabled veterans home. The reporter was a young woman named Claire Vasquez, who was clearly aware that she was working with material that was either a heartwarming human interest story or a complicated ethical question, and was not entirely sure which one her editor wanted. She spoke to Bull first because Bull was the most visually appropriate person to speak to. Large man in leather, gray beard, bikes in the background, the contrast, the story. Bull, to his credit, was concise. He said they were there because a veteran needed help and they could provide it. He said the chapter didn't do it for attention. He said if she wanted to talk to the man they were helping, that was up to him. She came to Hank. Hank looked at the camera for a moment. He had declined the camera 6 weeks earlier. He considered declining again. Then he thought about the things that had been said, about impressions, about implications, about whether it was appropriate to accept help from men with complicated histories. He thought about the 46 days it took for the FEMA letter, about the 3-year waiting list for accessible housing in Comanche County, about the 90-day apartment in Lawton that would have taken him 40 miles from the life he'd built. He said, "Sure." The interview lasted 15 minutes. Claire Vasquez asked mostly the right questions, which was more than he'd expected. She asked about the VA process, the FEMA process, the timeline. She asked what it was like to lose everything at 58. She asked how he felt about the angels. Hank said, "These men showed up. That's what I can tell you. I got a phone call. They came. They said what they were going to do, and they're doing it." That's the whole story. She asked him if it gave him pause, the reputation, the club's history. He looked at her steadily. He said, "When you're sitting in a trailer waiting for paperwork, you stop worrying about reputation. You start caring about who's actually standing in front of you." The piece aired 2 days later. It spread. This is where the story got complicated, and this is the part that Bull told me, with something that I can only describe as a quiet, tired anger. The kind of anger that comes from having the same experience repeated enough times that you can predict it exactly and still can't stop being bothered by it. The comments on the news station's website were, in aggregate, a portrait of the thing that nobody wants to look at directly. Some people were moved. Some people responded the way you'd hope people respond to a story like this, with something approaching recognition that help can come from unexpected places, and that the measures of a person are not their patch or their past. But a significant portion of the response that generated calls to the church, a letter to the county commissioner, and 3 separate conversations in which various community members expressed concern to the pastor, was along different lines. Why were these people in Fletcher? Weren't there other organizations that could have helped without involving a criminal gang? Who had authorized this? What were they going to want in return? Should a disabled veteran, a man representing American service, be associated with an organization like this? Bull sat in my clubhouse 3 years later and said, "The man served his country. He lost his legs. He lost his house in a tornado. He waited 6 weeks in a box for a government check that barely covered a month's rent." And the thing people in his community wanted to talk about was whether it was appropriate for him to accept help from us. He picked up his glass, put it down again without drinking. "That's what prejudice cost," he said. "Not just us. It cost him too. All those weeks in that trailer while people decided whether we were the right kind of help." I want to be accurate about what happened next, because it's easy to frame what the angels did as heroic and what the community did as simply wrong. And the truth is more complicated than that. The community was not malicious. The concerns were not invented out of thin air. The Hells Angels history is real, and the instinct to be cautious about it is not irrational on its face. Dale Hutchins was not a bad man. Pastor Featherstone was not a bad man. Sandra Briggs was doing her job. But the thing that Bull was naming, the thing I've turned over in my head since that night in the clubhouse, is the specific quality of the concern. It wasn't about Hank. It never really was. It was about comfort. It was about whether the presence of men like us disrupted the image of things, whether it looked right, whether it fit the story the community had of itself. And Hank, in his trailer, was irrelevant to that calculation. That's what the prejudice cost him, not our reputation. We've carried that for decades, and we'll carry it until we're gone. What it cost him was time. 6 weeks and then another 3 before the town council managed to decide that the project was proceeding and they had no legal basis to object, and perhaps it was best to simply let things take their course. 6 weeks in a box while people decided whether the help was appropriate. Meanwhile, 23 men in leather cuts were building him a house. The frame went up. The roofing crew came and went in 3 days, efficient as weather. The electrical was done by the end of week 2. The plumbing required a subcontractor, a licensed plumber named Gary from Lawton, who Bull called in a favor with, and was finished in 4 days. The drywall went up. The flooring, luxury vinyl plank, low-profile transitions at every doorway, no thresholds, was laid in a single long Saturday by 6 men who worked from 7 in the morning until the sun went down. Grace Ann came out on that Saturday. She walked through the structure with a measuring tape and her notepad, checking every dimension against her list. Doorways, 37 inches minimum. Check. Shower. Roll-in. Curbless. Reinforced walls. Check. Kitchen counters, 34 inches high, knee clearance below. Check. Turning radius in each room, 60 inches. Check. She checked everything. Then she stood in the middle of what would be the living room, bare subfloor, walls rough drywalled, but not yet painted, sunlight coming in through windows that hadn't had their trim installed yet. And she was quiet for a moment. Bull was standing in the doorway. He'd been overseeing the flooring work and had paint on his forearm from a can he'd carried past a wet wall. Grace Ann said, "You did all of this right." Bull said, "We had a good list." Grace Ann said, "You followed the list." Bull said, "It was the right list." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you for doing this, for doing it correctly." Bull said, "Don't thank me. Thank the people who took 6 weeks to decide whether he deserved help. They're the reason we're here." Grace Ann nodded slowly. She put her notepad away. The 4th week brought the finish work: paint, trim, cabinet installation, a modest deck at the front entrance with the proper slope, and a railing at the right height. One of the writers from the Tulsa chapter, a man in his 50s who turned out to have 20 years of finished carpentry in his background, built Hank a set of accessible raised garden beds, 4 of them along the south side of the house, exactly where the originals had been. He hadn't been asked to do this. He'd heard Hank mention the garden once, in passing, while they were talking over coffee at the folding table one morning. He'd gone to the lumber yard the following day and bought cedar boards on his own account. When the beds were finished, filled with fresh topsoil, positioned at the right height for a man in a chair, he came to Hank and said, "Thought you might want these." Hank looked at them for a long time. He said, "You didn't have to do that." The man, his name was Vince, Bull told me, though I never learned his last name, said, "I know. That's why I did it." The house was finished on a Friday afternoon in late July, 51 days after Bull's first phone call. They did it the way they did most things, without ceremony, without announcement. The work was done. The house was ready. Bull walked through it one final time with Hank, the two of them moving from room to room, Hank in his chair, Bull slightly behind him. Every door swung wide. Every threshold was level. The shower was what he'd asked for. The kitchen was what he'd asked for. The deck faced south, and the afternoon sun was coming through the windows at the angle that made the empty rooms look like they were waiting to become something. At the end of the walkthrough, they stood on the deck together. Bull said, "Anything that needs adjusting, you call me." Hank said, "It's right, all of it." Bull nodded. Hank was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that Bull repeated to me word for word, because it was the thing he'd been carrying around for 3 years. Hank said, "I spent a lot of time in the Army learning what the mission was. You had a thing you were supposed to do, and you did it, and that was the measure of it. After I got hurt, I spent a long time trying to figure out what the mission was in this other life, the one in the chair." He paused. "I thought the mission was just surviving, making it from one day to the next, not being a burden." Another pause. "You guys changed the mission." Bull said, "What's the mission now?" Hank said, "Living, actually living in it." Bull picked up his coffee cup from the deck rail, one of the folding table cups from the camp, paper, nearly empty, and held it up. Hank held up his. They touched cups. That was the ceremony. The Angels broke camp that evening. 23 motorcycles, loaded up, pulling out of the Baptist church lot in the slanted light of a July sunset. The sound of them leaving was tremendous. That wall of engine noise that fills the chest and then moves away, fading up the highway until it was gone and Fletcher was quiet again. Hank sat on his new deck and listened to them go. Sargent was beside him. Dale Hutchins was standing at his property line about a quarter-mile east, watching the bikes disappear. He raised a hand at some point, though Hank wasn't sure if it was directed at the Angels or just a reflex. People wave at things that are leaving. Grace Ann had come out for the final day. She was sitting in a folding chair she'd brought herself, the kind of thing she did without making it a point. When the last motorcycle sound faded, she said, "How does it feel?" Hank thought about it. "Real," he said. "It feels real." She nodded. "That's what it should feel like." He looked at the south wall of the house, where the 4 cedar garden bed stood in the long afternoon light. He'd already been to the hardware store for seeds, not that day, but in his mind. He'd been going through the list, tomatoes for certain, peppers, maybe some kale which he'd started growing in the last garden because the deer left it alone. He'd need to get the soil tested. He'd need irrigation if the summer stayed dry, which in Oklahoma it generally did. He had things to do. That was the point. He looked at Grace Ann and said, "I'm going to start planting next week." She smiled. It was the first full smile he'd seen from her in the 2 months since the tornado. She had one of those smiles that's been held in reserve, earned, specific, not deployed lightly. "Good," she said. The story didn't end quietly, though. Stories in small towns rarely do. The news piece had circulated further than any of them expected. It had been picked up by a veteran-focused website out of Washington, then shared widely enough that within a week, Hank was getting emails through the VA, through the church, through channels he couldn't entirely trace, from people who'd heard what happened. Other veterans, people who'd lost things, people who wanted to offer help, though most of what he needed had already been provided. Among the emails was one from a woman in Tulsa whose late husband had been in the Marines. She'd seen the piece. She said she'd been holding on to her husband's tools, a full workshop set, quality stuff, Milwaukee and DeWalt and Snap-on, because she didn't know what to do with them. She didn't want to sell them. She'd been looking for the right person. She asked Hank if he could use them. He wrote back and said yes. The tools arrived 3 weeks later in a rented truck. She drove them herself. She was 71, small, with white hair, and the careful movements of a woman who was still getting used to doing things alone. She and Hank sat on the deck for 2 hours drinking lemonade while she told him about her husband, and he told her a little about the workshop he'd had and what he'd built there. When she left, she said, "I'm glad they went to someone who'll use them." Hank said, "I'll use them, I promise." She drove back to Tulsa. Hank looked at the boxes of tools stacked in his new garage, the concrete floor level and accessible, the workbench at chair height, the overhead light Bull had insisted on, despite it not being strictly in the plan, and thought about the lawnmowers and generators and the go-karts he'd fixed for the neighbor kids. He had a workshop again. He had a garden. He had a house with doors wide enough for his chair, and a shower that didn't require contortions, and a kitchen where he could cook his own food. He had a life that was his again. The thing about prejudice, and this is the part I've been sitting with since Bull told me the story, is that it operates at a distance. It makes decisions about people before it's ever met them, based on what it thinks it knows, based on what it's been told, or what it's seen from far away. It decides what kind of help is appropriate and what kind of help is complicated, and whether the man in the trailer has time to wait while those determinations are made. The Hells Angels have a reputation. I know this better than most because I've worn the patch for 32 years, and I've watched that reputation precede me into rooms my whole adult life. I've seen people lock their cars when we pull in. I've seen waitresses look past us like we weren't there. I've been asked to leave establishments by men who were frightened of what we represented. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm not telling you we're misunderstood angels. We're not. We're men who made choices and lived by them, and some of those choices were ones we'd make differently now, and some of them we wouldn't change. But I know what Bull told me, sitting in that back room with the jukebox going in the front and Travis asleep against the wall. I know what he said at the end of it, after the whiskey and the long telling. He said, "We built the man a house. We asked for nothing. We did it right." And the people who took 6 weeks to decide whether that was appropriate, most of them never once came to the lot and picked up a hammer. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Judge people by what they build, not by what they look like building it." I've thought about that a lot since. Hank Kowalski is 61 years old now. He's still in that house outside Fletcher. The garden has been expanded. He got ambitious the second year and added 2 more beds along the east wall. He trades produce with Dale Hutchins, same as before the tornado. Dale came over and helped him with a fence project last fall, and neither of them mentioned the conversation they'd had about impressions and appropriateness, which is the right way to handle such things. Sargent died last winter. Hank got another dog, a younger one, mixed breed, currently making its way through Hank's furniture with the thoroughness of a creature that doesn't understand possession. He named him Private First Class, which is what the vet tech at the animal shelter called an extremely specific name for a very chaotic dog. Hank thought that was about right. Grace Ann still checks in. not as his assigned worker. His case was closed 2 years ago, but as something closer to a friend, the way those lines sometimes move when two people have been through something real together. She came out for his birthday in March. She brought a pie. He grilled chicken. They sat on the south-facing deck in the March cold with their coats on and talked about things that had nothing to do with FEMA or accessible housing. Bull and the Lawton chapter come through once or twice a year. They don't make a thing of it. They stop by, drink coffee on the deck, check that everything's holding up. One of them, not the same guy every time, always seems to notice something that needs a small fix and quietly takes care of it before they leave. Hank asked Bull once, during one of those visits, what had made them reach out in the first place, how they'd heard about him, who had made the call. Bull thought about it. He said, one of our guys saw the newspaper piece, the one that ran the week after the tornado. Small thing, inside the paper. He shrugged. Said you were a vet. Said you'd lost everything. Said nobody had a good timeline for when things would get better. He picked up his coffee. That was enough. Hank said, that was enough. Bull said, yeah. I'm 72 years old. I've been riding since I was 21. I've seen what this life does to men who are good and to men who aren't. And I've watched us be judged by the worst of what we've been and the best of what we've done in roughly equal measure, depending on who's watching. I don't have conclusions to offer. I'm not built that way. But I'll tell you what I think about when the wind picks up on a night like the one Bull told me that story, and the fire burns low, and the old bones settle into the chair the way old bones do. I think about a concrete slab in Fletcher, Oklahoma. I think about 23 men in leather cuts showing up on a July morning with lumber and tools and the particular kind of quiet purpose that builds things. I think about a man in a wheelchair watching walls rise on the ground where a tornado took everything. And I think about what it means to judge a thing by what it builds. By that measure, the only one that matters in my experience, those 23 men were the best people in Comanche County that summer. Not because they were perfect, not because their history was clean, but because when a man had nothing and nobody was moving fast enough, they showed up and they built. That's the whole story. That's the one that stays.